everyone. Welcome to Tryon Palace Live here on a Tuesday morning. I'm Lindy Cummings. I'm the research historian here at the Palace, and I thank you for joining us for a look at the Barbour Boat Works that used to operate here in New Bern. Before we get to Barbour Boat Works, however, we have a quick word from our executive director, Bill McRae. And so that'll be about 1:40. So I'm very excited to hear what he has to say to us today.
Hello, I'm Bill McRae, Executive Director of Tryon Palace, and I'm speaking to you from the Kellenberger Garden on the grounds of the Palace. We have missed our visitors and are excited that our gardens will be open to the public. But we're doing a number of things to protect both our staff and our visitors. We are limiting visitation in certain areas. We are not opening hands-on exhibits. We have installed plexiglass shields at our ticket counter and at our museum store register. And we have hand sanitizers all over the property. The way station will be open for ticket sales from 10 to 4, Tuesday through Saturday, and from 12 to 4 on Sundays. Our gardens will remain open until 5 o'clock to give you plenty of time to enjoy our beautiful formal gardens and the kitchen garden. Our museum store, located in the North Carolina History Center, is open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 4, with a maximum capacity of 9 guests. We at Tryon Palace are excited to offer our gardens once again. Welcome back to Tryon Palace.
Well, I don't know about the rest of you, but I think that's pretty exciting. I've really missed being in the gardens here. This is definitely one of the loveliest seasons for our gardens, so I think that's going to be high on my list of priorities, is to get out and see those in the coming weeks. All right, well, to the topic at hand. This is kind of a combination / repeat of 3 previous talks that I've given on the subject of Barbour Boat Works. Most of them associated with an exhibit that we hosted here in June 2018 through 2019. And for the exhibit and for some of the images that you're going to be seeing today, I am indebted to members of the Barbour and Rivenbark families and staff at East Carolina University, Joyner Library Special Collections. Without their generosity, we would really have nothing to share with you, either from the objects perspective when we had the exhibit or from most of the images that you're going to see today. So I'm very grateful to them for preserving those. So from 1932 until 1997, Barbour Boat Works operated on a lot between East Front Street and the Trent River. And that site is now occupied by the North Carolina History Center, and that's where I'm broadcasting from this morning. So if you look out over my shoulders and see some of the vistas over the river, those are the sites that would have been a daily view for Boat Works employees. In its heyday, in about the mid to late 50s, it was a family-owned business producing all wood pleasure craft and some commercial fishing and ferry vessels. And today, the name Barbour is really synonymous both with the business, whose presence was felt here for so many decades, as well as with the classic pleasure craft that are really prized by both collectors and enthusiasts alike, and continue to grace our local waterways. All right, so it was in the summer of 1997, and 3 men, Paul Fontenoy of the Beaufort Maritime Museum, Don Lennon of ECU's Joyner Library Special Collections, and Tryon Palace's own Peter Sandbeck, arrived at the Barbour Boat Works site, and they began to process and salvage historically important documents and artifacts from the company's history in advance of an auction that was scheduled by the works owner at the time. Don Lennon and his graduate students from ECU loaded up a van with boxes of water-stained documents that had miraculously survived about 4 major hurricanes between 96 and 99. Fontenoy was busy identifying the boats and the equipment to be transported down to Beaufort, and Sandbach had sent off an emergency request to the National Park Service's Historic American Engineering Project. And then 2 staff had flown down from Washington, D.C., and they conducted a photo documentation of the site before the auction took place. And the image that you're seeing here on your screen is one of those photos taken by the staff from the national parks. And this is one of the manufacturing buildings where they would have built the boats. And as you can see, it's looking more or less like a storage site, although there is a boat hull down there in the distance. So really it was, by and large, the efforts of Fontenoy, Lennon, and Sandbach that are continued today by Joyner Library, of course, and the Beaufort Maritime Museum, which still has about 400 artifacts, including boats, and the palace, which has utilized the old boat works site. The site at that time in 1997 was a deteriorating site, unfortunately. The state purchased the boat works in 1997. They'd started the process in early spring, and by August that was completed. It would be another year, however, before the last employee using the equipment that was remaining on site was vacated. Of course, one of the major issues was neglect. As you can see from this photograph here, also one of the Historic American Engineering Record photographs, the buildings were in a general state of disrepair. You've got fundraising going on, and palace staff were largely responsible for the maintenance and security of the site, which it was a significant task. In '99, there were 2 hurricanes, Dennis and Floyd, well, Dennis twice, Floyd once. They swept through the region, and they really just, heaped more damage upon the already fragile site, collapsing roofs, damaging transformers, threatening some contamination, etc. And so by the beginning of the 2000 hurricane season, staff were deeply concerned that if we had another hurricane like Dennis or Floyd, that there was enough loose debris that it would blow about the site and perhaps even damage downtown structures. So it was really an unfortunate and inexorable decline for a site that really not even 50 years prior had been one of the most successful builders of small wood pleasure craft and had continued to operate on building commercial vessels before that. So who was Herbert Barbour, and what were the boat works? Herbert, who you see here, I'm going to just put a little circle around him if I can. This is Herbert right here. This is him pictured at the christening of a ship, probably mid-1950s. I think this was 52, 53, possibly 55. The exact date is slipping my mind. In the center picture, you have a gentleman out in one of the vessels they were building in the 50s. It's definitely hard to make out the face, but the hat is kind of a dead giveaway. That was a style of hat worn by Herbert. And then to the far right, you have Herbert pictured with his 2 daughters, Inez and Marie. And this is their home that was on East Front Street, about where the galley store is today. Not exactly that area, but that green space is kind of where Herbert's home sat. Herbert was born in 1882 in Swansboro in Onslow County. He was born to a very skilled carpenter and his wife, who had a large family of 5 sons and 2 daughters. Unfortunately, Herbert's father passed away when he was about 40 years old, and after that point, the sons had to go out to work to support their mother and younger siblings. Of course, this is prior to the 1930s, so there was no social safety net as we know it today to help people who had lost a husband and had a large family to support. And so Herbert's mother would have depended upon her children being able to go out and earn some money to help with the family finances. Herbert probably never had anything more than a third-grade education, but he did self-educate by borrowing books from a neighbor and reading. One of the skills that he picked up by observing neighbors at their work was that of boat building. And so he would watch local men who were in the fishing industry around Swansboro, building boats in their backyard. And according to his granddaughter, he built his first boat about age 11. And so despite the lack of formal education, he really had a natural talent for boat building, which of course, involves curves and, kind of being able to understand how the boat is going to move through the water. So those are kind of really good mathematical skills that he would have had. He was really an artist, and wood was his medium. So let's take a look here at Herbert as a young man. This is one of the ships that he built. It's a 50-foot screw, and it was named the Rosalind. And this is his brother-in-law, Ernest Windley, and he, with their boat on a local waterway. So if you can kind of see here, this kind of black silhouette against this wharf is Herbert. And then this gentleman sitting here on what looks like a bale of goods is his brother-in-law, Ernest Windley. So this is about 1903, and this was shared with us by Herbert's granddaughter, Jean. Well, by 1910, he had moved up to New Bern, where the job prospects were a little bit better, and he came there with his wife, Robina. And first he worked as a carpenter, and then a few years later, the U.S. Census recorded that he was working at the Meadows Marine Railway on East-South Front Street. And so you'll notice here, this is a Sanborn fire insurance map for that portion of East Front Street. And there is the Meadows Marine Railway. And this image is of the Marine Railway, shared with us by the New Bern Craven County Public Library. And that's one of the things that I think when you walk around downtown now, it's so picturesque with, sidewalk dining and restaurants and shops and whatnot. It's hard to imagine that it was once a working downtown, and you would have walked up and down the street and seen wharves and warehouses and porters carrying goods, and of course work like rehabilitation of ships and shipbuilding going on. In an interesting coincidence, Herbert, Robina, and eventually their two daughters, Inez and Marie, lived at 24 George Street. And 24 George Street was the name for the Tryon Palace Stable Office before it was restored in the 1950s. And during this period, Herbert was continuing to work for the Meadows Railway. He had risen from a yard carpenter to foreman to a superintendent at Meadows. So I think that really speaks to his capabilities, both as a boat builder, but also as someone who could just really work well and manage people. By 1929, of course, you have the Great Depression, and it's in full swing. By 31, Meadows Marine Railway had closed its doors, and Herbert was unemployed. And of course, unemployment, up until the present crisis, the unemployment levels during the Great Depression were the highest that the nation has ever seen, really. And so to be out of a job like Herbert was really significant. According to his granddaughter, Herbert then moved down to a largely vacant lot on the west end of South Front Street, and he opened his own boat building business. He couldn't get a business loan from any of the banks at the time, which is hardly surprising, but he was successful in getting some private loans from local Jewish business owners. And of course, that takes a lot of guts. If you think about like the Great Depression, how bleak things were, how bleak the situation was nationally, for Herbert to basically decide to venture forth and create his own business when odds were stacked against him as far as like success, took a lot of courage. So what was at South Front Street in the year 1931? Well, Here again is an image from the Sanborn Fire Insurance map and for 1931. And you'll see that the site is largely vacant. You have here a Barbour and Hunnings handle factory. I'm not sure if the Barbour of the Hunnings handle factory is related to our own Herbert Barbour, but there's a handle factory there. You've got a few buildings that are labeled S, so probably shops. And then, of course, most significantly, you have actually a significant finger of the Trent River extending onto the site near the railroad tracks. And of course, Norfolk Southern still runs trains along this line over here. By 1948, however, the site looks much different. Note how it has changed. Fill has been added so that that center finger of the Trent, which was roughly in this area here, that no longer exists. And what happened was in the 1930s and 40s, Works Progress Administration were coming in and adding fill to the site. Much of it was sawdust from the mills in the city. Of course, if you think about New Bern sawmills, maybe don't necessarily jump to mind. If you're local, it does, because you know about the history of Roper Mill and things like that. But there was a lot of sawdust, and so they were using that as fill on the site. And you can see here, you've got your boat building right here. You've got a planing mill that is right here in the center. So he's taking raw harvested lumber and planing it down custom for the boats that he's building. You have the machine shop right here, and so they're building works for the boat motors. And then right up here is what will be the showroom, or actually this probably is the showroom at this time, 1948, brick showroom that kind of became a fixture on the street. So he's taking raw lumber from start to finish. There are 2 sawmills on site, the planing mill, as I mentioned, boat storage, and then a large boat building. Well, what were they building during this early period between 1931 and the start of World War II in 1941? Well, unfortunately, we really don't know a lot about the period between 32 and the 40s because those records were unfortunately lost. Leading up to World War II, the yard experienced a rapid conversion. They're gearing up to produce ships for Lend-Lease, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So the records got shuffled and they even lost. The site was also experiencing repeated flooding over the decades. And so some of those records from the early period would have been lost or damaged and then eventually thrown out because waterlogged paper tends to not fare well down here in our humid environment. What we do know is that Herbert was building custom sailboats and small runabouts, skiffs, rowboats, things like that. They were also working on some commercial vessels. If you notice here, this clipping from a Carteret County newspaper is this christening of a state fisheries patrol vessel. And I love this not only because it gives us an idea of what the Works was building in its early years, but also for the wonderful alliteration in the title of the piece. Catherine of Carteret christens cabin cruiser Croatan with clam juice. I feel like we just don't write newspaper titles like that anymore. It's very clever. Much of the inquiries that were received during the war years also give us an idea of what they were building during this early period. You had a lot of requests for custom sailboats, things like that. And the geography, the widespread geography of these requests suggests that Herbert's reputation as a boat builder was already spreading beyond the state. Now, one thing we do know that he built were specialty racing hulls. He had become well known for his hulls while he was working at the Meadows Marine Railway. He had a co-worker there, Albert Crabtree, who built engines for the hulls that Herbert was crafting. And after the war, racing would continue to interest New Bernians, and the East Carolina Yacht Club was actually founded by 4 or 5 young men who raced the local waterways, and one of those was Herbert's own grandson, Reggie Rivenbark. So this lovely post-war image of these 3 men racing on what I believe is the Trent River is courtesy of John B. Green from the New Bern Public Library. And I love this picture. And so I'm very happy that John was willing to share that with us. Custom boat work, however, was really set aside as the World War II began to get more serious. One of the biggest production challenges that the boatworks would see. So in 1940, the Congress passed the Lend-Lease Bill, or H.R. 1776, a very kind of telling title there. It was designed to assist U.S. allies by giving them supplies to assist in the military defense against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And even prior to Lend-Lease, you have local papers reporting that it's very likely that ships for naval defense are going to be built in the state. And Barbour wasn't the only shipyard that was building for wartime naval construction. You have the Wilmington shipyard. They were building Liberty ships. And then shipyards in Elizabeth City were also contributing vessels. Barbour really built 3 different types of ships. Minesweepers, and that was the bulk of what they built. They also built some net tenders and 2 salvage ships. So here are examples of 2 ships that were built in the Barbour yard. You have your minesweeper here to the left. And what these ships would do was they would, basically go along and sweep for mines. They had a patented system where they would drop down a cable and it would move along the ocean floor and sever anything holding those mines in place. Those would pop to the surface, and then they would use small munitions fire to detonate those mines so that they couldn't blow up larger vessels like a warship or any other larger vessel that will be out there. And then you have also net tenders, and that one's shown to the right. Net tenders would put down net that would sort of corral mines or prohibit submarines from moving into sensitive spaces. During this period, the yard exploded from a handful of men. We're talking 6 to 12 employees to around 1,200 men coming in round the clock for work shifts. And Rembert Rivenbark, Herbert's son-in-law, recalled that at the time, they didn't even advertise for workers. Men just showed up and then they trained on the job. As the war started to ratchet down and war production started to ratchet down, Herbert started to think about this type of post-war production that he wanted to work on. And so he's able to turn his creativity back to the work that he loves the most, and that's designing and building beautiful boats. During the war, the company had received hundreds of postcard inquiries asking about, could they purchase a small rowboat or a skiff? Could they have their small boat repaired? And they really had to just keep putting the potential customers off because it was hard enough to get supplies for needed industries like fishing vessels, and you had to petition the war board in Raleigh to grant you permission to use supplies for anything else but specifically designated construction. So materials were in short supply, which then also makes it difficult to have anything to build your prototype vessels for what you hope will be your post-war models. So they planned to have a new line ready in 1945, but it really wasn't until mid-1946, when Herbert and his son-in-law were able to basically start marketing a line of small craft for order. To the left here is one of the first post-war advertisements for Barbour's new line, and this is a particular small utilities boat. The gentleman that is shown here in the advertisement, this is his son-in-law, Rembert Rivenbark, and this was in Yachting Magazine. And this first advertisement really touched off what became a decade of a successful boat building. You also have an example of one of the many hundreds of inquiries that the Boat Works received. They were on typed postcards, they were handwritten. Some people, unfortunately, asked for a catalog of current products, but forgot to include their return address, so I assume they did not receive anything. But they're fascinating to read. By the early 1950s, Barbour had received dozens of inquiries from businesses seeking a Barbour franchise and customers seeking Barbour boats. They were coming from across the United States and the world. You can see here in this word cloud all the different locations from which they were receiving inquiries, and in different languages. So Cuba, Mexico, Nevada, Africa, Rhode Island, Alaska, Kansas, Brazil, Oregon, Egypt, which I think is one of the most fascinating ones, Guam, Bolivia, Mozambique, the Congo. And it got to the point where Rembert actually had to write to someone seeking a franchise and just let them know that we're snowed under. We can't even possibly meet demand at this point. By 1953, by the third quarter, staff were turning away all potential franchise inquirers because they couldn't even meet production for the existing dealers that they had, much less take on new ones. And I guess if you're a small business, maybe that's a great problem to have. Your demand is outstripping supply. So they were definitely booming. Here is an image of some local kids on local waterways. They're docked with their Barbours, just hanging out. It kind of reminds you of the pictures of young people in the 1950s hanging out in a 1950s car with, you know, kind of the iconic car. So in New Bern, apparently they hung out in their Barbours. I spoke with one gentleman who grew up locally, and he said that one of the things he recalls from being a young man in New Bern is that you were either a Barbour fan or you were a Commodore fan. And Commodore was a competing boat company that was started by a former Barbour employee. Unfortunately, I don't really know a lot more about Commodore, except that people feel very strongly about Barbour or Commodore. There was some hard feelings there between Barbour and Commodore. Here's one of the first advertisements for one of Barbour's best-selling boats. We have one in we're fortunate enough to have one in our collections. This is the Silver Clipper, and it was introduced in 1955 in 2 lengths, and then later on there were additional lengths that it was available in. You can see in the photograph in the lower corner, right here, there's a Silver Clipper in action, and it's actually towing a water skier. And that's another popular pastime that young people enjoyed in New Bern, and that was water skiing. Well, about the time that Herbert in the Boat Works debuted the Silver Clipper was about the same time that there were some major technological changes in the boat building world. The first was the introduction of fiberglass after the Second World War. And of course, fiberglass and plastics are a significant leap forward for boat and the automobile industry, among many other things. I mean, I don't know that we would even, if you think about modern life without plastic, it's almost impossible. Larger boat building corporations like Chris-Craft out of Michigan, which is the ad that's featured here, the 23-foot all fiberglass Commander, they are kind of jumping on board that fiberglass train and adopting it exclusively in contrast to wood hulls. By contrast, in '55, the Silver Clipper is debuted with mahogany decking and trim and an all-wood construction, which makes it a beautiful boat, but just not made of the most brand new materials. The New York Times had this title on one of its pieces about the boat show, the big boat show there in 1955. Wood sidetracked for plastics and construction of small boats. So the question is, why didn't Barbour turn to plastic from wood? And I've heard several reasons why that was. In interviews, Rembert Rivenbark said that they knew that they couldn't compete with larger boat building industries. They already had their shops set up for wood, and the conversion, they just couldn't compete with that. Herbert's great-grandson related that his great-grandfather really didn't sense that there was any creative inspiration in plastic and fiberglass, and that's probably true. You're going from a handcrafted boat to a molded boat. There's also a lot of problems with early fiberglass if you think about new technologies working out the kinks. So it may have seemed like this was a fad and it wasn't going to stick around. But Herbert's granddaughter, Jean, said that he probably would have turned to fiberglass given more time. Unfortunately, in 1957, Herbert passed away. And since he was the chief visionary behind the wood boat portion of the business, it was kind of hard to continue that afterwards. And so the yard turned from small craft at that point to exclusively commercial production. And that was a whole different ballgame. So here is a picture of the yard in the 1960s after they've shifted to all commercial work. So if you remember that earlier image of the boat works from 1948, the yard really hasn't changed a whole lot from that layout. So here, this right here, this is the showroom, the brick showroom with these really large plate glass windows here in front. Behind it, you have storage and a machining shop. You can see here, there's actually a boat up on some rail lines. They had 4 different rail lines that could accommodate different tonnage, and I believe the maximum tonnage they could accommodate was 1,200 tons. This is the boat building shop that they had built during the 1940s. And out here is one of the most fascinating buildings. If you look out here, this little A-frame building kind of hanging out over the water. This was actually built as a barracks for British seamen who were coming in the 40s to pick up vessels that Barbour built as part of Lend-Lease. And a lot of the minesweepers that the Barbour yard was creating were created for the British Navy. And those vessels went on to have many more years of service after World War II ended. And if you're interested more in Barbour production during World War II, there's going to be a forthcoming article in the New Bern Historical Society's journal that looks more closely at that wartime production. Here's an example of some of the large-scale commercial work that they were doing. This is an oil tanker. I think it was about 250 feet long, and it was built for Esso, or ExxonMobil today, and it's the Centam. So you can see here there's actually a tug probably getting ready to pull this guy out. One of the major issues with building the larger commercial vessels is that, of course, Barbour is west of the Norfolk Southern Rail Line, and the Norfolk Southern Rail Line runs back over the Trent River, and there's a railroad turnstile bridge. And that turnstile bridge is fairly narrow, and so it really limited the types of vessels that Barbour could build and get through the turnstile and down the Neuse and out to the intercoastal waters. And there was one ferry, one of the grandsons recalled a ferry that they basically had to squeeze it through by this, they barely made it through because the ferry was kind of the largest size that they could possibly get through the turnstile. Here's an example of some of the ferry work that they did. This is the Sandy Graham, which was built for the North Carolina ferry system. And here on the deck, these are Herbert's grandsons out on this maiden voyage of the Sandy Graham. There are, as of 2017, there was still a Barbour-built ferry working in Canada, and I believe 2017 may have been the last year that it was in service. Here's another example of some innovation for commercial vessels. This is, I believe, the 1970s, and they're christening a commercial vessel that had an innovative automated shucking system for harvesting clams. So the ship is taking a lot of the hard handwork out of shucking and getting those ready to bring back to the land. And then here is the site about 30 years later, mid-1990s. And of course, once again, it's easy to see that very little has changed since the 1940s. A few more buildings have been added, But still, it's just very, very much a similar layout. Here is that barracks that I mentioned in the previous aerial that was built for British seamen. That remained standing until about 1996. I believe that building came down in the wind and storm surge of Hurricane Fran. And one of the interesting anecdotal bits about that building is it had I believe it was an 11-burner cast iron stove in it that they would cook all the meals for the British servicemen. And that went straight to the bottom of the Trent. So somewhere down there at the bottom of the Trent River is a rusted out hulk of a large stove that was used in that building. Here again you've got some type of a barge that's up on one of the lighter rail lines there. You've got two ships in repair as well here. One of the things that it looks like is the shoreline is about right here. But you'll notice that it looks like the water extends all the way back to here. Well, the reason that the ground here is so black is that they were doing a lot of repair work in this period to small Navy vessels and commercial vessels. And they were using coal slag abrasives. The brand name is Black Beauty. So coal slag abrasives, they were using it to sand off paint and rust from hulls. And of course it was just kind of everywhere on site. Up here this is the showroom right there. And then if you think this building right here is still standing, this is the little antique store. And over here is the present day Newbern Farmers Market. Still standing. So 1997, the boat works had generally ceased operation. The restrictions of the river depth and that Norfolk Southern rail line turnstile bridge had really prohibited the boat works from being able to take on the larger and larger vessels that were available for contract bids. And so when the state acquired the property in order to develop a new visitor center, which is now the North Carolina History Center, several of the storefronts belonging to the boatworks were being rented out. And then, of course, you have major hurricanes that are causing a lot of damage on the site and that kind of inexorable decline that we kind of started this story with. And so they started to sort of do some piecemeal demolition of buildings at that time. It would be over a decade before the visitor center was completed and opened to the public in 2010. And of course, now the site looks very different. This is the opening of our Barbour Boats exhibit, which we hosted in 2018 and 2019. And one of the most special objects that we were allowed to borrow for that is this item right here. This is the only known hull built by Herbert, and it's a racing hull. So those images, the image that I had earlier of the racing on the rivers, local rivers, this one was built by Herbert for his grandson, Reggie Rivenbark, and it's called the Captain Hub. And it's been beautifully restored by craftsmen down at the Beaufort Maritime Museum. And that's its permanent home. It was on loan to us for portions of the exhibit, and it goes out to the different boat shows up and down the coast. But it's permanently at home down in Beaufort. And so if you ever get down to Beaufort to the Maritime Museum, do take a look at it. It really is a charming little vessel. Well, of course, it seemed too coincidental that a site that had weathered so many storms in the past saw one of the most severe hurricanes in the last few decades. Of course, we had Florence in 2018. Kind of ironic. Maybe a little bit of Murphy's Law at work there. As soon as that exhibit went up honoring Barbour Boats, it pretty much almost promptly closed because of damage to the site from Hurricane Florence. Luckily, the Barbour exhibit received no damage. But the History Center itself was closed for a couple of weeks. And so one of the things about the site is that if you recall from one of the earlier slides where I talked about how we got rid of that finger of the Trent that used to protrude up alongside the railroad tracks, that was all infill. And so one of the fun facts about the History Center is that, the ground just kind of slowly sinks over time because the site was once right in the river. And so eventually, I suppose one of these days, maybe hopefully decades and decades down the road, the river will reclaim its own. All right, well, if anyone had any questions, I hope you dropped it in the box. There's the Boatworks site today with the North Carolina History Center. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you all might have. And get my notes out of the way here. And I'm going to have my assistant take a look and see if there's any questions at all, and I'll do my best to answer them. Good Lord, the Barbour research started, it seems like forever ago, 2017, I believe. And so sometimes my memory of some of the details starts to get a little hazy over time, and I don't know about the rest of you, but the last couple of months have felt like a couple of years. And so all of this seems like a lifetime ago. It's almost hard to remember life before pandemic, details before pandemic. All right, well, there don't appear to be any questions. If you think of anything in the meantime, you can always find my email or phone number on our website, and I'm always happy to answer inquiries or point you in the right direction to hopefully find more information. And join us Thursday, 10 a.m. right here. We're going to have a tutorial on facial coverings with our fabulous costumer, Leslie Lambrecht, and I'm certainly excited about getting some tips on creating a custom facial covering. So join us for that. And thank you all and have a great day.